So the title of our presentation and the report as well is still divided, but more open, mapping European attitudes towards migration before and after the migration crisis. So the context, we want to give some context, and I'm sorry to say, but we will more tell about the methods we use, because we think that interpreting the results necessitates the understanding of what we measure and how we measure it. So we have to do that in the introduction before actually turning to the results. So what is the context? The context is that this is a continuation of our previous study that was published approximately a year ago, also with colleagues from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Budapest. It was titled Looking Behind the Culture of Fear, Analysis of Attitudes Towards Migration in Europe. In this present analysis, we aim to fill in some of the gaps that our previous study did not cover, and we would like to provide a wider time frame to our analysis instead of focusing on one point of time, because that study focused on 2014-15, so a period before the migration crisis occurred. Now we want to see how attitudes have changed from before the migration crisis to after the crisis, and we also want to show a wider time frame, so the data we have allows us to go back to 1.5 decades, so back to 2002, and show how attitudes have changed along these 1.5 decades. The key question is whether the arrival of large number of refugees and the challenges they posed to Europe's states, their infrastructure and societies have transformed, whether they have transformed Europe's European attitudes or attitudes of European people. So has the map of Europe changed in terms of people's attitudes? And if so, what are the main factors that are heightening or dampening anti-migrant sentiments? So we know that the crisis of 2015 has caused deep political fractures within the European Union and is still one of the key issues along which debates and ideological clashes crystallize in the European Union. This also has triggered the rise of political populism and became a key topic of populist political powers in Europe. Therefore, we think that it is vital that we understand what triggers the fear of migration and whether social attitudes towards migrants and migration are actually supporting the rise of anti-migrant narratives that we have seen in the previous presentation. It is also essential to see which are the social groups that are more likely to perceive immigration as a threat to their countries and societies. And we would like to find individual and societal factors that are likely to play a role in modifying fear about migrants and consequently feed into policies towards a calmer environment in this respect. So the research questions very shortly: what has changed since 2014? The second big question is how did attitudes change on a longer run in the past 1.5 decades since 2002? This is how long we can go back. And what are the triggers of anti and pro-migrant attitudes? Our previous study looked into macro level triggers and individual level explanations. Now we included in our analysis some further explanatory variables, namely the support of political parties. And here we focus explicitly on populist political parties because we wanted to see the connection there. And the basic human values, which feed into attitudes as well as political support. And also the question that we raised after the previous analysis is whether it is a good idea to frame attitudes in terms of nation states, or now we will look also into regions, and we will answer the question whether states or regions or so subnational or national level is the best geographical categories to explain variations in attitudes towards migrants. So very quickly about methodology, we used the European Social Survey. We used data from 2016 and 17 representing 20 European countries, so not all of Europe, but most of Europe. And for the time series analysis, we use all the rounds from the European Social Survey, so we go back to data from 2002. And this represents only 15 countries, because there were only 15 countries which took part in the survey, in all the survey rounds, in all the 8 survey rounds. So why do we use European Social Survey? We use it not only because it is enabling us to do cross-country comparison and time series comparison, which is quite special, but also because in a scholarly field this is considered as the most reliable and most controlled type of data, survey data. So this is basically, to put it short, the best data we have in Europe. A few words about the conceptual framework. So attitudes are very, very complex and difficult phenomena. It's very difficult to also to define what is an attitude, and therefore it's very difficult to measure what is an attitude. We use the ABC, the most widespread model of attitudes, which includes 3 elements or components of attitudes. The affective component refers to how we feel about migration, so emotional component. The behavioral component, the B component, refers to how one behaves or expects others to behave toward migrants. And the third, the cognitive component, refers to beliefs, knowledge, and thoughts about migrants and the consequences of migration. And here, not we, but also the ESS and the literature differentiates between material and symbolic attitude, namely, symbolic refers to how people evaluate the consequences of migration in terms of how it affects their culture, their values, the norms in the country, while material component reflects how people feel about the consequences of migration in terms of economy, welfare system, labor market. So we use 2 measurement tools. One is perception index that we used, that measures the cognitive component of the attitude, so what people think about how migration will affect the economic life, the norms and culture, and the country altogether. So this is a composite index from 0 to 10, and 0 to 100, sorry. The medium is completely neutral attitude, 100 is very positive, and 0 is extremely negative. Oops, mit csináltam? Okay, the second index we used is rejection index, which measures the behavioral component of attitude and shows very simply the share of those who would reject any migrant to come from poorer countries outside Europe without any consideration. So this is kind of extreme. This is extreme rejection of any kind of migration from outside Europe. We use throughout the analysis both indexes, and we do so not only because they measure different aspects of attitudes, but also because this validates our results. So having 2 indicators and showing quite similar phenomena validate the results of our analysis. I'm not going to speak about this model, but you can find it in the report. This is just to show that we also considered a number of theories when we were designing the research and explanatory variables for the analysis. So let's turn our attention to the results. This is the main finding of one of the main findings. So here, the blue side of the chart shows the perception, the rejection index. So, namely, what is the percentage of the population that would reject migrants to come and settle in their countries? And the right side, the green, shows this composite perception index. And there are 2 important things to mention about this chart. One is that on average Europeans, so this is the average here, this dotted line, and it's 53, which shows that on average Europeans are very neutral about migration. They see as many advantages as disadvantages of migration. Another important, however, the behavior element is quite different. So people would behave quite differently in different European countries concerning acceptance or rejection of migrants. And this is another finding that we want to emphasize, that the way or the extent to which the same cognition or perception of migration is turned into action or expectation how to act towards migrants is very different. So let's see the example of Hungary and Czech Republic. Here you can see that their perception of migration are quite similar, rather negative, but they would quite differently act towards migrants. And the same goes for France and Lithuania, again, very similar perception of migration. Still, this turns into a much stronger rejection of migrants in Lithuania than in France, or the same comparison can be made to Norway and Ireland. So the thing we want to emphasize here is that in fact, we suspect that the strength of norms as set by political and public discourse is decisive in determining the degree to which negative attitudes are transformed into explicit rejection of migrants. Okay, we promised to show you how attitudes have changed. And here is a chart. It shows, I think I will jump because this is more visible here. This shows the same data. So this is the change from before the migration crisis to after the migration crisis. One is perception index, so the cognitive element. The other is rejection index, the behavioral element of attitudes. And the noteworthy thing here to mention is that it is only Hungary where both perception and rejection index has significantly worsened or became more negative. No other country in Europe has become significantly more negative towards migrants. However, there are several countries which became significantly more positive towards migrants, and these are Portugal, Spain, the UK, Ireland, and if we only look at the rejection index, it's also Belgium, for example, that became more positive. All the rest is, the change is not significant in the rest of the countries, like the big countries like Germany, Poland, they didn't really change significantly. So this is quite new. This is also surprising to us, but it's probably valid because other researches like the Pew Research Institute made a big research, they came to the same conclusion. And as I emphasize, these data are very strictly controlled, and these data represents the entirety of the society, not only one segment, not only the extremes, but also those who don't shout on the street. Okay, so we were also interested, of course, whose attitudes have changed, and we focused on the countries where attitudes have changed significantly. In Portugal, Spain, and to some extent also in Ireland, in all demographic groups became more accepting of migrants. Still, the change is largest among old, less educated, rural people who experience financial difficulties. So the most vulnerable groups in these countries have become more accepting of migrants. So those who were very rejecting of migration previously, there we see the largest shift. In the UK, it's somewhat different. It's rural, working age people who are no longer young, but who are working and who possess moderate education and again experience financial difficulties. We wanted to emphasize this because this is exactly the demographic characteristics by which we can define Brexit voters. So those people became more accepting of migrants, which is a very interesting finding. And finally, in Hungary, all demographic groups became much more, significantly more hostile towards migrants, but the most prominent change was measured among young, upper middle class, metropolitan citizens to those who are basically the future of the country. So this is, oh, I'm running out of time, I have to speed up. So this is a bird's eye view. We also checked or analyzed data back to 2002, as I promised. So here you can see data for every second year. The first columns show 2002, then 2004, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16, 17. This is only 15 countries, because there were only 15 countries that took place in all the 8 rounds. So somewhat less number of countries, but here the most important finding is the extremely surprising level of stability of attitudes. So if you look at the perception index on the top, you can see the score, and you can see that it basically did not change. 52, 51, 51, 53, so it's not significant, no significant changes. It's very neutral and very, very stable. Rejection index, so the behavioral component, is also pretty stable. It always has a larger volatility, but it's also pretty stable. And mainly the most important conclusion is that we do not see that even large crises in Europe, like the 2008 financial crisis or economic crisis, or the 2015 migration crisis, would have caused major shifts in attitudes towards migrants, which is, I think, a very important and very significant finding. And finally, we categorized the countries based on how they changed. And just very shortly, and you can read much more about that in the report again, the first category of countries are those where acceptance of migrants have always been very big. The rejection index has been always below 10%, and it has not changed throughout the last 1.5 decades. These include Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland. Not big surprise about that. And the bulk of European countries belong to this category. Namely, we called it countries with modest level of rejection, with some fluctuation. Here in the report, we tried to give an explanation of the fluctuation for individual countries. But anyway, these countries have always had a modest level of rejection, and these include the bulks like Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Finland, Spain, and Poland, which is an outlier of the ex-communist countries in this respect. There are 3 countries which had relatively high level of rejection, but in which the rejection has significantly dropped in the last 2 or 4 years. So the acceptance of migrants has increased. This is United Kingdom, Portugal, and Ireland. And finally, those few countries where rejection of migrants has increased. Hungary is a category on its own. Basically, it dropped out of the European map. Attitudes in Hungary are much closer to Turkey or Russia than to other European countries, unfortunately. While Czech Republic, Lithuania, and also to some extent Italy and Austria are those countries where attitudes have become slightly more negative since 2014. And now I would like to.
Okay, in the second part of the presentation, I will talk a little bit about the role of regions, as Vera has promised, the role of values, and some findings about the link between attitudes towards migration and political orientation and party affiliation. This is a traditional method that we took countries as the basic units of analysis, and we tried to overcome this tradition by trying to be blind towards countries and bring regions into the middle of our analysis. And this is the map that shows the regional averages of the perception and rejection index. And what we see here, that more or less it is still the political community of a country that have the largest impact on how people think about migrants and migration. Still, there are some trends, namely the first one is that there's a clear dividing line in certain countries between metropolitan regions and the rest of the country. Just a technical comment, the data allows us to make a regional analysis for some countries on the NUTS 2 level and for some countries on NUTS 3 level, depending on the size of the country. So these are not, region doesn't refer to the same technical unit for all countries. The other trend is that there are some countries where there's a clear east-west or north-south divide. Namely, this is the UK, to some extent Italy, and there's a difference between the eastern and the western part of Germany. And there are a number of countries which are rather homogeneous. As you can see, it's from the colors. For example, Hungary is such a country, the Czech Republic, and also on the other side of the spectrum, Sweden and Norway lie to the same category. This is just a kind of interesting list of the top 20 and the last 20 regions, and this also verifies our finding that countries are still the most important units in this analysis. As you can see, all 7 Hungarian regions are on the top. So if it would be a sports contest, nothing threatens the pole position of Hungary in this respect. And the other regions are coming from a few countries, namely Estonia, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, and from Austria. And on the other side of the table, or the bottom of the table, we find most of the regions from Germany, Sweden, Norway, one from Finland, and one from Portugal. You can just compare the sheer rejection index numbers. So you can compare Dél-Dunántúl from Hungary with 76%, with basically 0% from 3 German regions. Vera also mentioned that we focused on the role of the basic human values in our analysis, and we are lucky in a sense that the ESS is probably the best source, or this provides the excellent opportunity to study basic human values, and it has a proven legitimate list of questions that tries to capture what kind of values people value the most and the least for their personal lives. And there are a number of values, 10 values that are measured in the ESS, and we analyze the link between attitudes towards migration and these values, and we found that there are 2 specific values that are most correlated how people think about migration and migrants, and this is security, and the other one is humanitarianism. Just very short, values are the abstract principles or notions that guide individuals' behaviors and opinions, and they stem from primary agents of socialization, namely family, peers, and schools. So they are culturally rooted, of course, on the one hand, but they are also very individual. Security values denote the desire for stability, secure physical surrounding, and the desire for a strong government that ensures safety for the people. While on the other hand, humanitarianism is basically about understanding, respecting, treating one another equally. And there's a rather linear trend. So this is a chart that shows the importance of these 2 values based on all respondents from the European Social Survey. And it shows that security, if the people who value security more have more negative attitudes towards migration, while if you value humanitarianism more, that results more positive attitudes towards migration. And of course, the rejection index works differently. If we see some country results, there's also a clear trend. We just simply made 3 groups, we categorized every individual into one of 3 groups. The first one is where you value humanitarianism and security values equally. We don't take into consideration this group. These are the percentages white in the middle. For example, for the case of Hungary, it would be 78%. But we focus on the 2 other categories, the yellow category, which denotes people who value humanitarianism over security, and the purple, which are people who value security over humanitarianism. And again, there's a kind of linear trend. Of course, it's not purely linear, but it shows a clear difference between the rejection index and the proportion of people in the given society who value humanitarianism over security. Of course, you can value humanitarianism more over humanitarianism when you have security. So it's a very strange game between the two. But you can find more details about it in the report. And last but not least, during the analysis, we found out that there are basically thousands of people in this European Social Survey dataset that have very, very extreme attitudes on migration. Technically, they are the ones who scored 0 on the perception index. And we found it very interesting, so we tried to focus on them a little bit more. So we selected them and just looked at how they proportion by country. And there you can see that it reached almost 10% in Italy and Hungary. So 1/10 of the population in these two countries could be considered the extreme rejecter of migration and migrants. But the proportion was also quite high in the Czech Republic and Austria. And what we did, that we just separated them from the rest of the data set, and we tried to run several models to find those factors that contribute or that increase the likelihood that somebody will fall into this group of people, and try to find factors that decrease the likelihood of having extreme negative perception of migration. And there you can see in the 2 columns of this table what are these factors. Just to name a few: if you have severe financial difficulties, if you feel unsafe at night in home, in your surroundings, that's a typical question from the ESS. If you feel yourself politically alienated, your political orientation is closer to the extreme right wing, you have low level of interpersonal trust, you feel unhappy in your personal life, you value security-focused values more over humanitarian values, and if you are older, these are all factors that tend to push people to the extreme negative attitudes towards migration, while having tertiary education, having foreign-born ancestry, and placing high importance on humanitarian personal values, having high level of interpersonal trust, and being younger, and are all factors that remove you from this category. And if we take a look at the political orientation and political party preferences, we find a very clear relationship between how people, where people put themselves on a political scale from left to right, and what are the averages of the perception and rejection index. And there you can see that those who identify themselves with the left, they have above average perception indexes and below average rejection indexes. Those who identify with the center are somewhat mixed. And those who put themselves on the right, so on a 0 to 10 scale, they say that I'm on the right with 7, 8, 9, or 10 scores. They tend to be more rejecting and less positive about migration. And if we took a step forward and we try to link these attitudes towards political party preferences, and again, this is an important footnote, that this data is from 2016 and 17. So this reflects to the party sympathy and party preferences from 2, 3, 4 years ago. 2 or 3 is for some kind. Why we talk about 16, 17 is that because the fieldwork took place at different times in different countries. So there's a time range when the ESS was carried out, so it's not the same for all the countries. But there you can see the differences between, let's say, the right wing, the main right-wing populist party, and some selected central-left political parties. This is the case for Austria with the FPÖ and the SPÖ. The same pattern applies for Germany with AfD and SPD. with France, Front National and PS. Hungary is a little bit special case because we are quite homogeneous in terms of negative attitudes. Italy, Lega Nord versus PD, the Sweden Democrats versus SAP, and the same applies for the United Kingdom. So there is a difference between the party supporters. So this is basically the biggest gap that we could identify is based on these party preferences. Okay, a few conclusions, namely 4. The first one that refers to what Vera has said just a few minutes ago, that we could find, or we found a quite stable level of attitudes, with some notable country differences, of course. So over a period of 16 years, and based on the data of just 15 countries, that's very important here, the overall perception of migration, as well as the share of those supporting the explicit rejection of migrants coming from poorer countries outside Europe, have not changed radically. That was shown by a chart. The second remark is that we focus on theory, that contact and control theories apply the best to Europe's attitudinal map. Namely, anti-migrant attitudes are the strongest in those countries where migrants are hard to represent. There's a scatter plot in the report where you can just check it empirically. And these are the countries where people lack the feeling of safety and control over their own lives and futures, which contributes very much to the negative attitudes. And also people who feel politically disempowered, financially insecure, and without social support, they are the ones who most likely become extreme, or not just extreme, but just simple negative towards migrants. Remark 3 is that the basic human values of security and humanitarianism govern attitudes towards migration. The more people value security, the more negative their perception of migration is, and the more they reject the idea of any migrant settling in their country. On the other hand, the more people find respect for others and equality between people important, the more positive their attitudes are towards migration and accepting migrants in their country. And our last comment or remark is that attitudes towards migrants and political preferences correlate strongly. Maybe this is not a big surprise finding in a room like this, but we have proven that right-wing populist parties are those that gather successfully that part of the population which is very negative towards migrants and migration in general. And they fuel, of course, this, the recreation of this social group. The perception of the consequences of migration are quite similar, basically very negative among voters of right-wing populist parties across Europe, but the level of rejection shows larger differences, which means, or we suggest, that based on the degree to which dominant norms set by mainstream politics matter in terms of transforming aversion into an extreme rejection of migrants. So much depends what happens in terms of political communication and media landscape in the country, and that is how the behavioral and the other element of the attitudes are separated in countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.